The diplomatic chamber of the interstellar tribunal fell into complete silence, not the kind born of protocol or reverence, but of a growing unease that pressed inward like gravity collapsing in on itself when the sensor feeds across 12 sovereign observatories simultaneously confirmed an impossible fact that 17 unidentified vessels had emerged from the Foldstorm breach, the most volatile and long-abandoned corridor of warped space, thought unusable, untraversable, and absolutely uninhabitable by any civilization that valued the sanity of its crew or the coherence of its physical matter ambassador, Avar Haraon of the Vaxaran Continuum, whose reputation for composure was rivaled only by the icy stillness of the asteroids surrounding his homeworld, leaned forward just slightly, not enough for theatrics, but enough to register a shift in posture so rare that the diplomatic aide beside him instinctively tightened his grip on the scroll tablet he was holding. "They are Terran," said Avar, in a voice so calm that it was indistinguishable from the ambient hum of the room. "But they are not vessels we have classified. Their signatures are accurate, yet altered, rewritten, across the circular hall of crystalline glass and archived memory." The Sarek's inquiry representative, Marl of thought-tethered kin, did not blink. Her species blinked only in dreams, but she vocalized her thoughts in harmonic intervals, as her kind did when thoughts required urgency, layer beneath diplomacy. "They have returned, but they returned differently than they left. The hulls speak new languages. 10 years prior, the Terran Concord Fleet, the only fully unified military diplomatic force among human factions, had vanished from the Inner Delta Theater without warning, without comes, and without recovery. The tribunal, already splintered by ideological disagreements on how to categorize human unpredictability, had filed the event as causal collapse through unknown means, an elegant way of saying they disappeared, and we don't know why. The Mercat Consortium, always eager to profit from predictive instability, had suggested the humans had encountered a spatial disaster of their own making, experimental tech, perhaps gone too far. The Kasari Stratagem, who viewed silence as weakness, argued the humans had staged their own demise to return later in strength, though a decade of absence cooled that theory into irrelevance. The Iskari Preservers, archivists of cultural legacy, had petitioned the tribunal to place a cenotaph in the outer archives, treating the Terran race as one lost to the void, like the distant and enigmatic Kalari before them. Yet now, the humans had returned. And they had returned without explanation. The lead vessel, designated TSV Amaranthin, broadcast a diplomatic frequency that had not been used since the Terran representative dissolution at the tribunals. Fourth, restructuring, precise, formal, respectful, ancient by their own standards, almost ceremonial. No weapon systems activated, no escorts. Only the calm pulse of a request to parley, not to negotiate, not to surrender. Simply to speak. "They do not posture," said Avar Haraon, eyes narrowing the way a glacier narrows a canyon across centuries. "That is what disturbs me most. When a species re-enters the galactic sphere after 10 years of silence and technological unknowns, it is expected that they either demand recompense for abandonment or seek vengeance for past offenses. But these ships carried neither flame nor flag. Their arrival, methodical and symmetrical, lacked the tension of conquest or the desperation of plea. They floated, not idly, but deliberately. They emitted no challenge, no proof of survival, no apology that silence was more calculated than any. Fleet formation. They are human, but not Terran as we knew them," said Marrow, her voice dropping in frequency until it bordered on the inaudible, a sign of philosophical discomfort among her kind. "They learned something out there, and they carry it without pride, which makes it more dangerous than any weapon." There was no way to measure how far the Terrans had traveled. The Foldstorm breach was believed to be a galactic cul-de-sac, a collapsing tesseract that spat out matter in unpredictable spirals and inverted physical constants on a whim. To travel through it for 10 hours was suicide. To remain within it for 10 years was by every known model of physics and mind unthinkable. Yet here they were, the tribunal's internal priority channels lit up with nervous coordination. The Cassari demanded immediate containment maneuvers. The Mercat argued for information trade. The Preservers requested observation-only engagement. But Ivar Harald silenced them all with a sentence that landed with the elegance and certainty of a well-measured verdict. We will send a ship, not to intercept, but to meet them. We will listen, not to confirm our fears, but to test their purpose. It was not consensus. It was leadership, the diplomatic vessel Covenant of Intellect. A Vaxxaran artifact ship equipped with over 3,000 languages and a silence library etched in sentient crystal, departed that same day toward the neutral edge of the tribunal's demarcation line, with authorization to speak, but not to accuse, to question, but not to imply on board. Ivar Harald walked alone through the observation corridors, the stars blooming like whispers across the transparent surface of the ship's hull, until he reached the private reflection chamber. He did not meditate. He did not recite. He simply stared, long and hard, into the direction where 17 human ships now waited with patience that no warlike species had ever mustered. If they come bearing weapons, we will respond with shields. If they come bearing words, we must bring questions. But if they come bearing silence, we must prepare to remember what we forgot about what it means to return after being lost. And far across the void, TSV Amaranthan hovered still, quiet, and glowing faintly at its seams with light that bent reality ever so slightly at the corners. The tribunal, for all its age and wisdom, had prepared for every kind of reappearance, except this, the return without declaration, the presence without demand, the silence that waited to be interpreted, and in that silence, tension rose quietly, strategically, inevitably. The edge of tribunal space was not a line, nor a wall, nor even a threshold in the strictest sense, but rather a political fiction reinforced by censor nets, surveillance buoys, and mutually observed restraint. A shared illusion of borders in a galaxy that had never obeyed lines drawn by committee. It was here, on the invisible margin between negotiated space and ancient unknown, that the Covenant of Intellect approached the formation of Terran vessels, 17 in total, equidistant and aligned in what the Vaxxarans would later describe as resonant symmetry, a design philosophy found only in species that treated geometry as communication. There was no escort to meet them, no transmission inviting docking, only the quiet acknowledgement of presence, and that, as Ivar Harald would later note in his debrief, was the first true act of diplomacy the Terrans had performed since their return. Hulls of the Terran ships shimmered with reactive alloys that did not merely reflect light but reinterpreted it, shifting color and depth based on vector position. And even though this was unconfirmed intent of observation, the central ship, TSV Amaranthan, bore no visible weapons, no shields raised. Yet the ship's silhouette against the foldlight bled into impossible, curvature suggesting dimensional mass displaced in a way no tribunal race had ever engineered or survived. We are not prepared for this. The Covenant's linguistic eye whispered through the room's ambient interface, its voice carefully devoid of tonal implication. They have exceeded the envelope of known structure. Ivar did not respond to the AI. He stood at the forward observation dome, hands clasped behind his back, his eyes locked on the silent formation, as if willing it to speak first. Vaxxarans did not rush diplomacy. Time was not their enemy. It was their instrument. And finally, a transmission arrived, no static, no encryption. Challenge, just a voice. This is Commander Lena Rourke of the Terran Concord. We greet you in recognition of past accords and seek to converse not in defense, not in demand, but in mutual reckoning. The voice was steady, female, mid-tonal register, spoken in the old tribunal standard, an archaic tongue only preserved for ceremonial records and long-form treaties. That she spoke it fluently was not simply preparation. It was a message Ava responded without delay. His voice composed. Ceremonial Commander Rourke. I am Avar Hown of the Vaxeran Continuum, charged with provisional inquiry on behalf of the Interstellar Tribunal. You present in numbers. You present in silence. You return without preamble. I ask you, with the precision required by this chamber, what is your purpose? There was a pause, but not long enough to be interpreted as reluctance. To be heard, she said, and to confirm that others may soon arrive who do not ask to be heard. The chamber aboard the Covenant went still again, the eye falling silent, even its self-correcting resonance halting as the gravity of the phrase settled across the consciousness of those present. Rourke continued, not in haste, but with the cadence of deliberate translation. We have encountered a civilization. It did not seek us. It did not flee us. It did not trade or teach or colonize. It simply was. Its principles were silence, balance, and unbroken observation. We learned to listen. And through that listening, we learned to exist beyond reaction. Avar's fingers flexed once at his side, a subtle gesture, but one the aide across the room recorded and later analyzed for emotional significance. You vanished in the middle of armed conflict. Avar said, you return with knowledge, with ships unknown to us. You return with knowledge, with ships unknown to us, and with implication that others follow. Do you consider yourself changed? Do you consider yourself human still? Rourke responded immediately. We did not change to leave our nature behind. We changed to understand it. Our humanity has not diminished. It has expanded. What we were is not gone. It is better understood. The phrasing was surgical, designed for interpretation without provocation. Avar felt the weight of it and respected it. You do not speak of war. You do not request alliance. Yet you approach the tribunal. You must want something. There was a longer silence now, a silence that tasted of calculation, but not evasion. We want you to know that the space beyond the Foldstorm is not empty. Rourke said finally, we want you to know that we returned because others will not speak first, and that our presence here, in silence and without force, is not a demonstration of peace, but of principle. The statement echoed within the chamber, then lingered after the echo faded, pressing against thought, against interpretation, against instinct. It was not a threat, not a plea. It was posture ancient in its elegance. Avar turned from the screen, walking slowly back toward the central axis of the chamber, the long trailing edges of his diplomatic sash brushing softly against the obsidian floor. He said nothing for several moments. Then finally, to the aide beside him, in a voice so quiet it nearly dissolved in air, they do not return as seekers. They return as witnesses, and witnesses must be heard before judgment is considered. From the far edge of tribunal space, 17 ships waited, not with hunger, not with fear, but with expectation, and the galaxy, for the first time in a decade, began to listen again. There is a quality to certain silences that defies the emptiness of space, a quality not of absence, but of precision, as if the silence itself is an act of governance, a framework built for meaning to pass through without noise. And it was this kind of silence that filled the diplomatic channel as TSV Amarantin established its direct communication node with the Covenant of Intellect, not with encrypted handshakes nor preliminary validation requests, but with a gesture of unwavering clarity. The node linked, the feed stabilized, and for the first time in over a decade, the tribunal saw the face of a Terran officer not as a prisoner, not as a broadcaster, not as a casualty of war, but as a representative who had not been chosen by hierarchy or command, but by alignment of purpose. She appeared not on a grand bridge of human design, nor in the sharp-edged steel interiors that tribunal records had associated with the Terran fleet. Instead, she stood in a chamber of impossible dimensions, soft-edged geometry, pale light without source, and surfaces that seemed to refract ambient. Intent more than visible like Commander Lena Rourke, mid-40s by human measure, eyes like basalt beneath ocean glass, voice composed, timbre steady, syntax precise without being robotic. She did not salute, she did not bow, she inclined her head. The exact fractional degree used in Tribunal Treaty Acknowledgement Protocol, an action that, according to the Vaxxer Aid's immediate analysis, had not been publicized or taught to non-treaty members for nearly 60 cycles. Ambassador Harelm, she said, we acknowledge the risk your people took in meeting us. We do not underestimate what silence costs among those who rely on communication to measure safety. The room aboard the Covenant remained still. Even the eye restraint programs refrained from processing atmospheric responses, as if even code had learned to listen. Avar Harel stood before the projection, arms relaxed at his sides, posture fluid, yet grounded in the centuries of diplomatic bearing expected of his lineage. He spoke with no amplification, though his words carried across the chamber with gravitational calm. You speak not as emissary, nor as commander of a returned fleet. You speak as something new or perhaps something restored. You carry human form, but not human manner. Why are you the one chosen to speak? Rourke's expression did not shift in offense, nor pleasure. She answered as one might answer a question of atmospheric pressure, factually without pretense, because I did not break, she said, and because I was among those who learned without taking. It was not boast, it was explanation. She moved slightly, not toward the interface, but within her own environment, revealing intentionally or not a circular configuration behind her. Made of lattice forms rotating slowly in anti-aligned orbits, they emitted no light, but their presence distorted depth in subtle increments, as if space within space had been folded, then taught to remain calm. We did not die, she said, but we did not continue. The Foldstorm suspended our concept of duration. Clocks broke, not from entropy, but irrelevance. Engines failed, not from damage, but from unfamiliarity with context. It was not terrain. It was intention. The place itself taught us that we were too loud to survive. So we stopped. And we listened. Avar inclined his head slightly, the gesture respectful, though not deferential. You speak of survival as learning, and of learning as surrender did. You surrender your power, Commander Rourke, or did you refine it? There was a pause now, not evasive reflective. We refined our restraint, she answered, and in doing so, our power became something that need not declare itself to be real. In the tribunal chamber aboard the Covenant, a subtle shift occurred, not a decision, but a recalibration of how the Terran return was being categorized. They had not come to assert. They had come to demonstrate what could be gained by refusing assertion. Avar moved toward the console, but did not touch it. Instead, he studied her bearing, her environment, the language she used, and more importantly, the language she chose not to use. You speak as one who has seen systems, not merely civilizations, but patterns. Are you warning US, or are you preparing us? Rourke answered with a silence that lasted 5 full heartbeats. Then, I am offering you time to think before others take away your ability to do so. That is not threat. That is courtesy. Avar nodded once, just once, and with that gesture, the status of the Terran Concord shifted within the tribunal lexicon from re-emergent variable to strategic consideration under dialogue. There would be no alarms sounded, no emergency votes called. Not yet, but records would show that on that cycle, at that hour, at the edge of known space, Diplomacy changed its rhythm because a species known for noise had returned bearing silence like a sharpened oath. There are names in the tribunal archives that are never spoken aloud, not because they are forbidden, but because they have no adequate articulation in sound names given to civilizations so ancient or so alien that to vocalize them is to risk misrepresenting what they were, or still are. And it was in this category that the Thronari were filed, not extinct, not allied, not adversarial, simply observed. The humans did not bring the Thronari with them. They brought the idea of them, and in doing so, challenged the very architecture upon which the tribunal built its sense of galactic centrality, asterisk. In a closed session transcript following the initial broadcast from TSV Amaranthine, Avar H. addressed the tribunal's inner circle via direct neuro-channel, bypassing traditional quorum debate. His words were recorded not in acoustic registers, but in neural phasings that the preservers would later translate into language for archival access. They speak of a civilization that taught them without teaching, a presence that guided without gesture. This is not cultural contamination. This is epistemological transformation. The Mercat envoy was the first to voice skepticism, not out of ignorance, but out of pragmatic concern. We have traded in every sector. There is no Thronari in our ledgers. If they exist, they offer nothing. If they offer nothing, they hold no value. To which Ava replied with a stillness that carried weight even through nonverbal interface. Some values are unquantifiable until the moment they are lost. The Kasari Stratagem Representative General Taruan, lineage-born, raised the counterpoint all had expected. If the Terrans possess new understanding and do not share it, that is asymmetrical advantage. That is not diplomacy. That is latency weaponized, but it was the Serex delegation. Through collective resonance, that posed the most subtle question. What if the humans have learned to live without need for dominance? What if their silence is not tactic, but belief? Chambers still then, not with agreement, but with reconsideration. Meanwhile, aboard the Covenant, Avar continued his one-on-one dialogue with Commander Rourke. He asked not of ships, nor propulsion, nor energy sources, but a philosophy. You encountered a civilization that made no demands, no language, no trade. What, then, did they give you? Rourke did not respond immediately. She gestured, and the projection behind her shifted. It displayed no map, no diagram, but an oscillating field of harmonic resonance patterns within patterns that were not meant to be deciphered, only felt. They gave us unmirrored self, she said, in silence. We heard our own thoughts without the noise of history. Avar considered this, then countered with measured skepticism. Such internality is dangerous for species with violent past's introspection. Without containment leads to collapse. How did you survive yourselves? Rourke looked directly into the interface, not aggressively, but deliberately. We stopped defining ourselves by what we defended against and began to understand what we were defending for. It was a concept the tribunal had not encountered in functional application. Defense is preservation. Yes, defense is deterrent. Certainly, but defense is revelation. This was new and dangerous, because if the Terrans had learned to defend without weapon, to influence without insistence, to expand without movement, then they had become something that tribunal was unprepared to model. Not an empire, not a threat, but a principle, a presence, a possibility. Avar closed the session with a final remark, transmitted privately to the preservers for archival notation. We are accustomed to speaking, to persuading, to projecting. But now we must ask, are we capable of listening without interruption, of learning without conquest, across the still corridor of space? The Terran fleet did not move. They waited not because they lacked motive, but because they had learned the value of stillness, and in that stillness, the galaxy began to remember what listening once meant, before speech became currency. Tribunal did not move quickly. not because it was inefficient, but because it had been engineered not to react in haste. Its strength had always been rooted in observation, in layers of counsel stacked upon precedent, upon memory, upon the long calculus of survival through collective deliberation. And yet in the wake of the Terran's return, something in that rhythm had begun to shift, not in panic, but in tempo subcommittees, formed to analyze linguistic nuances in Rourke's diction. Experts in archaic resonance reactivated from Preserver. Dormancy's military advisory threads pulsed with silent urgency, drafting containment protocols they could not publicly endorse, and still, the Terran fleet did not move. It hovered in resonant formation just beyond the designated borderline. 17 vessels aligned not in war formation, but in harmonic configuration, responding to quantum telemetry not with jamming fields or countermeasures, but with transparency of design that revealed too much and too little at the same time. They did not shield themselves, nor did they invite scans. They simply existed. It was that existence, unmarred by performance, that unnerved even the most experienced observers. So the tribunal sent a delegation of scholars, non-military, non-commercial, selected from the Ascari, the Serix, and the non-aligned Sul species known for their capacity to observe without presumption. They were granted a single boarding instance aboard TS-V Amaranthan, under specific limitations agreed upon via shared axiomatic negotiation. No weapon scans, no invasive telemetry, no demands. The delegation entered the vessel not through an airlock, but through what could only be described as a dimensional threshold, an aperture that did not open so much as allow. They emerged not into corridors of steel, nor control panels, but into curated environments, rooms that responded to them without surveillance, surfaces that did not reflect, but remembered. And at the center of it all, an archive, but not a human one. It contained no holograms, no data cores, no written text, only reconstructed ecosystems, terrains from other worlds. Miniaturized but stable, maintained not by human design but by foreign architectures that did not follow known ecological laws. The delegation documented a preservation habitat from the moon vessel the 9th declared sterile and collapsed by tribunal, decreed 2 centuries ago, now breathing within the containment field aboard a Terran vessel. They found coral lattice from the drowned city of Senro AKT on fallen world lines, rebuilt from genetic residue. They found Mephisti younglings alive. The Mephisti had been classified extinct, not presumed, not endangered, extinct. Genocide witnessed, recorded and mourned. Yet here they were playing in silence beneath a light that never cast shadows. The Serix representative, who had never recorded emotional deviation in 200 cycles of service, transmitted an internal memo that simply read, "The Terrans did not claim new territory. They rebuilt what others allowed to die." When questioned how they had done this, how they had traversed worlds broken by entropy, collapsed by war, and shattered by resource wars, Commander Rourke only said, "We listened to what the Threnari had preserved, not with tools, not with blueprints, but with presence. They do not rebuild, they remember in forms, and in doing so, they teach others how not to forget." The tribunal delegation was offered nothing, no trade, no alliance, no download, only the permission to observe what was being done. And when asked why now, why return, Rourke answered not with justification, but with timing, because others will come not to build, not to listen, but to extract, and they will not wait for permission. There was no fear in her voice, no tension in her shoulders, only the steadiness of one who had already endured the worst that silence could reveal. And with that, the delegation was returned, unharmed, unburdened, but changed, their reports quiet, non-sensational, methodical, circulated through the tribunal with viral slowness, read, contextualized, and somewhere in the background of High Council deliberations, a phrase began to form in private notes, in off-the-record observations. The Terrans carry not new power, but new restraint, and restraint is the rarest force in diplomacy. Averheiron, reviewing the findings aboard Covenant of Intellect, did not issue commentary. He simply underlined a phrase in the mission log with his personal glyph asterisk. They do not need us to believe. They need us to understand, and that is more unsettling than any armament. The tribunal had demanded proof, and proof was given not through weapon, but through care, and the galaxy, accustomed to fearing the loudest voice, began quietly to fear the calmest one instead. There had been divisions within the tribunal before, fractures of philosophy, commerce, jurisdiction, and memory, but none quite like this, because this was not a disagreement about what action to take, but about what the humans now meant, and meaning, unlike action, could not be intercepted or countered with force. Averheiron, whose voice had long been treated as a stabilizing axis within the tribunal's proceedings, convened the High Interpretive Council under Article 7, an extraordinary clause invoked only during paradigm-level realignments, where existing frameworks were no longer sufficient to contextualize new emergence. The chamber was constructed for stillness, designed not to echo. It captured sound and thought equally, storing them into slow memory crystal layers for millennial reflection, and into this chamber came 12 perspectives, the Mercat, calculating the Caesari, poised the Syrinx, resonant the Iscari, ancient the Vaxaran, balanced, and others. Minor signatories and watching powers, each with their own threshold for change. Spoke first, not to persuade, but to articulate a dilemma that had no precedent. The Terrans have returned not with threat, nor plea, but with revelation. They possess what we do not understand, and they offer it without bargaining terms. To accept their presence is to admit we were wrong about absence. To reject them is to pretend absence is still valid. General Taruan of the Caesari responded as expected. They have grown while concealed. This is strategic deception, whether they intended it or not. If we integrate their influence without scrutiny, we place our future under a shadow we did not see form. Preserver Talon of the Iscari responded, voice low with contemplative gravity. If we refuse what we do not understand, we become the very archive we fear, stagnant and obsolete. The Mercat envoy spoke next, fingers twitching across a ledger of probability models that revise themselves every 6 seconds in real time. Influence is not always measured by technology. Sometimes it is embedded in moral precedent. If humans now model restraint, then restraint becomes currency, and currency always flows toward dominance. The Syrinx sang their intervention in harmonic alignment. You assume their silence is strategy. We propose their silence is structure. If that is true, then we are not the center of this age. They are the edge it turns toward. The room fell into contemplative quiet, a diplomatic silence, not one of tension, but of mutual admission that the old categories no longer applied. Avar allowed the pause to lengthen, then offered a question rather than a declaration. If humanity now represents a force of balance, not through might but through ethical evolution, then are we still the stewards of peace or merely its observers? That question seated unease, not because it threatened status, but because it threatened assumption. For 10 years, the tribunal had treated the disappearance of humanity as closure, a solved problem, a vanished variable, but now their return suggested that silence had not been absence. It had been formation, and those 17 ships, floating not with power, but with purpose, now disrupted the very shape of how peace had been defined outside. The chamber and the sectors watching. The divisions had already begun to crystallize. Some planetary blocks opened their ports, others fortified their boundaries. Some species sent scholars, others sent spectroanalysis drones, and throughout it all, the humans made no further move. They issued no second message. They requested no meeting. They waited not in passivity, but but an unwavering awareness that to push would be to undo the very philosophy they had returned to embody when Avar returned to the covenant of intellect. He stood once more beneath the forward observation dome and watched as the Terran formation suddenly realigned itself, not in response to any external signal, but as if echoing an unseen celestial rhythm only they had learned to hear to his aid. He said only this: they came to show us what time can become when it is not spent chasing power, but understanding it. Behind him, the tribunal trembled, not with fear, but with the unfamiliar weight of reverence in every known civilization. There are moments when the present begins to collapse into the weight of what the future requires. And though these moments are rarely recognized as such while they unfold, the tribunal, through centuries of protocols, precedent and pain, had developed a precise internal lexicon for such thresholds. They called them points of anticipation, uninvited events that do not demand response, but will not wait forever, and in the rising shadow of the Terran return, it became clear that humanity would not ask for the future they carried. They would simply offer the conditions under which it might be approached, not delivered, not explained, only offered on the 5th rotation after initial contact. A delegation from the independent Sereth Enclave transmitted a diplomatic query to the TSV Amarantan, requesting passage through the Foldstorm. The message was respectful, technically sound, and dangerously naive, because what the tribunal had begun to understand, but had not yet stated aloud, was that the Foldstorm was no longer a navigational hazard. It was a gate, and not one they owned. The humans did not deny the Sereth request. They replied with a single sentence: entry without readiness will not result in destination. The Sereth withdrew their request within 2 hours, but the question had been placed into the diplomatic bloodstream of the galaxy. What lay beyond the Foldstorm, and why had the humans returned from it when no one else had ever emerged whole? Avar Atron reviewed the incident aboard the Covenant, cross-referencing the reply with multiple forms of logic interpretation. It was not a warning, nor was it a deterrent. It was a classification of access, of readiness, of consequence, and it aligned with everything Rourke had said and everything she had carefully not said. So Avar sent one final message, not to Rourke, but to those he assumed must now exist behind the Terran veil. The message contained no questions, only a reflection. We understand that what you have seen cannot be translated, that what you carry cannot be taught in words. But we ask only this: if we listen long enough, will we be allowed to hear what silence now contains? The reply did not come in words. It came in motion. The Terran formation did not advance. It rotated, not as a fleet, but as an axis, as though the 17 vessels had become a shared fulcrum upon which potential futures balanced the most. It would look like formation maneuver. To Avar, it was permission. The humans had no interest in becoming a guiding power. They had shed the aspiration to lead. Instead, they had become a point of reference, a new fixed star in the galactic night. Those who sought conquest would not understand them. Those who demanded allegiance would find no purchase, and those who bargained only in advantage would leave empty, for the Terrans had learned, perhaps from the Threnari, perhaps from their own ghosts, that influence without request is the most enduring kind. Rourke's voice returned once more. A final communique, not encrypted, not hidden. We are not the future. We are only what happens when one stops fleeing the past. The tribunal held no immediate response because in that moment they were not a government, not a coalition, not a court. They were students facing a teacher who did not offer lessons, only silence, patience, and time. There are names that do not pass cleanly between species, not because of phonetic difficulty, but because the concepts they represent cannot be reduced to equivalence. And the tribunal had long maintained that such names must never be forcibly translated. They must either be adopted in their native resonance or left untouched, suspended in respectful ambiguity. And so it was that the Threnari remained unnamed in any tribunal language, referred to only by symbolic reference, orbital designations, and the circumstantial reverence attached to what little remained of their supposed presence. But with the return of the humans, the Threnari no longer hovered at the edge of cultural myth. They became, by implication and through humanity's new posture, part of a lineage that the tribunal had never charted, forgotten future, whispered into the present of our heralded. Not record the new term offered by the Terrans in official protocol. He requested it in a private session with Commander Rourke, held via secure harmonic channel across a bandwidth designed for interspecies meditation. Not communication. He did not ask what the Threnari were. He asked how the Terrans referred to them now, not in maps, but in thought. Rourke did not hesitate. They do not give names, she said. They allow meaning to emerge through encounter. If we must speak of them, we use a term that cannot be fully spoken. We call them the unbounded. But even that fails. Avar considered this, then asked a question that had no protocol, no precedent. Are you still Terran, or have you become something else? There was a stillness in her expression that did not suggest discomfort, but gravity. We are still human, she said. But our definition of human no longer stops at our biology, or our institutions, or our myths. We are what remains after ambition is questioned. What continues when memory is recontextualized. The tribunal, listening from encrypted nodes with full consensus authorization, did not interrupt, because in this moment, the conversation had moved beyond policy, beyond law. This was legacy in real time, and legacy was not to be corrected, only recorded. Rourke continued, her voice not rising, not shifting, but softening in a way that suggested not fatigue, but reverence. The unbounded did not teach through structure. They taught through presence, and presence, sustained without explanation, creates alignment over time, over thought, over purpose. We aligned with what they were, not because we understood it, but because we chose to remain long enough to become something worth understanding. Avar did not speak for several moments. When he did, his words were etched directly into his diplomatic codex. Without filtration by aides, we believed peace was a product of balance, of treaties and checks, of language calibrated across cultural error. But what you describe is not peace. It is clarity, and clarity has no adversary, only delay. Outside the harmonic channel, the tribunal was not unified. Some viewed this exchange as philosophical indulgence. Others viewed it as spiritual intrusion. But a quiet minority, the most dangerous kind of consensus, began to form a consensus of attention. Because if the humans had encountered a civilization that no longer required tools to change the world, if they had adopted principles that operated beyond barter, beyond projection, then they had moved into a domain of influence the tribunal could not intercept, the domain of meaning, and meaning, unlike law, could not be repealed. Back aboard the TSV Amarantin, the humans made no demands. They offered no proof. They simply waited. The ships did not communicate again for 3 tribunal cycles. Their silence did not grow tense. It grew instructive, as if they believed that given enough stillness, even an empire would begin to listen. Empires do not listen quickly, because to listen is to yield the illusion that the narrative was ever shared. And empires are built not on shared narratives, but on authored ones, controlled, curated, and repeated until deviation feels like heresy. But the Terrans had not returned to author a new narrative. They had returned without one. And it was this refusal to define themselves that began to do what no armada, no embargo, no tribunal ruling had ever achieved. It made the empires listen. First came the Haruan Celestials, whose dominion over the fringe crescent was enforced through generational myth and ritual isolation. Their grand tactician, once a public denouncer of Terran unpredictability, filed a private inquiry through a neutral relay. If Terran vessels hold silence as signal, How does one respond in equal kind without diminishing the gesture? Then came the oral trade network, not in person, but through economic signal, rerouting 8 major trade routes to drift intentionally close to the Foldstorm periphery, not to provoke, but to observe, not to engage, but to risk noticing. Even the Kesari stratagem, known across the sectors for war readiness bordering on prophecy, held a summit where, for the first time in 200 cycles, they chose not to simulate Terran combat response algorithms. They chose, instead, to simulate Terran restraint, because silence, deliberate, visible, inhabited silence, had become its own form of message, and though most species did not yet understand it, they felt its gravity. Avar had observed these shifts from the observation chamber aboard the Covenant of Intellect, his presence a constant, even as consensus wavered. He did not advocate, he did not instruct, he merely reflected to his aide, who asked if this silence from the Terrans was meant as superiority. He offered only one reply: no, it is responsibility, and responsibility does not boast it bears. In private, he reviewed tribunal doctrine on first contact protocol. He compared it against what had unfolded, then set it aside, because this was no longer contact. It was consequence. Rourke had said little since their last exchange. No further communiques. No new philosophy, only the continued presence of those 17 ships, still ordered, unarmed in posture, immovable in purpose. And in that stillness, a new kind of diplomacy was taking root, not based on leverage, but on gravity of example. The preservers began to update their living codices, adding for the first time a new classification, influenced by inhabited silence. The Serix recorded their internal resonance shift. The Iskari convened a council of memory weavers. The Mercat, reluctant but astute, began preparing new economic models that could value non-transactional demonstration only. The Kesari remained outwardly resistant, but even among them, the first cracks of inquiry appeared. Tactical officers studying stillness not as absence of action, but as preservation of future agency. Avar knew what this meant. The Terrans had not won anything. They had not returned to claim victory, but they had done something far more subversive. They had become a reference point. And when an empire begins to calibrate against something, even in protest, even in denial, it has already begun to listen. The TSV Amarantin remained quiet, the lights along. Its surface pulsed in rhythms not meant to be decrypted, but felt a language of duration, of held breath, of ethical patience. And across the stars, one by one, the empires began to recalibrate. Is a quiet violence when a civilization begins to understand that it was never the center of the story. It has told itself for generations, not a bloody revolution, not a sudden collapse, but a soft and continuous dislocation. The slow erosion of assumed primacy replaced by a truth too balanced to be bitter and too calm to be denied. The tribunal had survived wars, collapses, the folding and unfolding of entire star sectors, not by holding power tightly, but by adapting to its shape, claiming stewardship of equilibrium through method and memory. But what the humans had returned to demonstrate was not a shift in power, it was a shift in orientation. And when a structure built upon centrality is faced with the undeniable presence of another axis, it must either bend or fracture. Avar Havar Hron did not fracture. He bent deliberately with clarity, and in doing so, became the first to say aloud what others had only whispered in cautious forums and private transmissions. We were never the center. We were only the most organized circle nearest the silence. This admission did not dismantle the tribunal. It refined it in the official convening, held on the 412th cycle since the founding accord. The preservers etched into the living record a formal acknowledgement of what they now termed the Terran reorientation. Not a contact event, not an escalation, but a structural inflection. The document was uncharacteristically brief. Let it be remembered. That when humanity returned, they did not bring domination nor invention, but balance, uninvited, and waited long enough for us to see it not as threat, but as mirror. The Terran fleet remained motionless for another full cycle after this. They responded to no pings, sent no data, offered no alliance, and then, quietly, as if acknowledging that the last chord had resolved, they turned away from the edge of tribunal space, not in retreat, but in return to the path they had learned to follow without destination. They left nothing behind except the shape of what they had been, and in their absence, a new kind of center emerged, not based on proximity, nor on hierarchy, but on resonance, because now, every decision made in the tribunal, every doctrine revised, every model recalibrated, would echo with the presence of what had once hovered silently just beyond reach. The Terrans had never asked to be included. They had never demanded recognition. They had only acted consistently, without explanation and without spectacle, and, in doing so, had reminded the galaxy of something it had long forgotten, that influence is not always loud, that change is not always forceful, that sometimes to shape history one must only return, wait, and leave without needing to be thanked. Of our Heron, now, near the end of his long service, made one final entry in his private diplomatic journal, not for publication, not for preservation, but for understanding. They came back, not to be known, but to remind us that we were never meant to stand at the center only, to orbit something better than ourselves.